Good morning. And welcome everyone here today in person and those tuning in online for the Remembrance Ceremony for the No. 2 Construction Battalion, Canada's largest all-Black battalion. I would like to begin by acknowledging the land upon which we work, live, and gather is Mi'kmaq, the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Pictou Landing has been the ancestral homeland of the Mi'kmaq Nation for thousands of years. I recognize and respect the enduring presence, contributions, and cultural heritage of the Mi'kmaq people who have stewarded this land for generations. I honor their rich history, their deep connection to the land, and their ongoing relationship with it. I acknowledge the historical injustices and ongoing impacts of colonization, including the displacement and mistreatment of Indigenous peoples. The effects of these actions are still felt today as Indigenous communities continue to advocate for their rights, sovereignty, and self-determination. For many centuries, Mi'kmaq people have welcomed visitors here to Kjipuktuk in peace and in friendship, and I acknowledge both the generosity offered and the forced sacrifices made by the Mi'kmaq people and the series of sacred and historic peace and friendship treaties, which is the foundation of the relationship between the Mi'kmaq Nation and the Crown dating back to the 18th century. As we gather here today, let us remember that this land we stand on carries the stories, knowledge, and traditions of the Mi'kmaq people. May we approach our time together with humility, respect, and a commitment to building meaningful relationships with the Indigenous communities whose land we are truly privileged to be on. In Kjipuktuk, Nova Scotia, I recognize that we are all treaty people. Quite separately from the land acknowledgement, I want to draw attention to the contributions of those who did not come to explore, to conquer, or possess the land, but they came to Mi'kmaq, some by force and others seeking freedom and independence. African Nova Scotians arrived here more than 400 years ago. And from that time on, they have contributed to the infrastructure and economic wealth of the towns and cities they helped to build, but from which they could not benefit. Let us endeavor to learn more about the ways in which our own respective communities were shaped by the historic contributions of African Nova Scotians to the province of Nova Scotia. My name is Lindsay Ruck, and I will be your MC today. This year marks the 31st annual Remembrance Ceremony, and I was here for ceremony number 1 when I was about this big, so it's really special for me to be here today for the 31st Remembrance Ceremony, organized by the Black Cultural Centre for Nova Scotia, who has partnered with the Canadian Armed Forces and town of Pictou to host today's event. My main job is to keep the agenda moving along, and it says in the script that is exactly what I will do, so that is exactly what I will do. I would like to welcome our special guests seated in the first few rows who will be introduced later on in the program. At this time, I would like all who are able to please rise for the anthems. We will begin with O Canada, followed by the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice, and our music today will be provided by the composite band of the 5th Canadian Division.
We'll
would like to invite the 5th Canadian Division Padre, Lieutenant Colonel John O'Donnell, to the stage for an offering of prayer.
United in our desire to pay tribute to the members of the No. 2 Construction Battalion and respecting the freedom of conscience and religion of each person here today, I invite you to join with me in prayer now, or to acknowledge in your own way the importance of this moment. Creator God, source of every blessing, we do well always and everywhere to give you thanks. As we come together this morning in this annual commemoration ceremony to remember and to pay tribute to the members of the No. 2 Construction Battalion, Canadian Expeditionary Force, we humbly ask you to watch over us and to open our minds and our hearts so that we may come to know your love ever more fully in the reflections and the prayers that we offer here today. Gathering within these walls and inspired by those who answered the call to serve Canada and its allies in spite of the obstacles, discrimination, and adversity they faced, we renew our commitment this morning to holding high the torch that they have passed on to us. May it shine ever more brightly here and in the days to come as a reminder of the light, the love, and the hope brought into our open world and magnified by the sacrifices they made and by the service they rendered in the fight against tyranny. We also give thanks this morning, O God, for the families and descendants of battalion members whose faith and commitment continues to inspire us to believe in a world where truth, forgiveness, and justice matter. A world where the equal dignity of all persons is understood and respected, and where the suffering of others is not met with indifference, but with compassion between individuals, within families, throughout communities, and amongst nations. May God, who is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end of all that is good and holy, grant to us this day the courage to listen and to learn with open hearts, the wisdom to discern the movement of the Spirit in our midst, and the grace to appreciate ever more deeply the importance of the legacy that members of the No. 2 Construction Battalion have left for Canada and for all Canadians. Amen.
Padre. I would now like to welcome Mervyn Broom, President of the Black Cultural Society, to the stage to offer an official welcome.
Yes, this is a very special day. Minister Fraser, Minister Gross, Brigadier General McDonald, Mayor Ryan, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Black Cultural Society of Nova Scotia, it is my honor to welcome you to the 31st Annual No. 2 Construction Battalion Remembrance Ceremony. Decades ago, the late Senator Calvin Ruck, the Black Cultural Society of Nova Scotia, and various individuals persevered with a mission to ensure that the men of the Black Battalion receive the validation and honor that had been deprived from them. Over the past 31 years, we have come a long way in bringing the light to this important legacy. From the National Historical Site recognition to the Canada Post stamp, the National Apology of 2022, and many other bold steps have been taken to ensure the legacy of the No. 2 Construction Battalion will never be lost and that it will be etched in the Canadian society and history. We must continue to be persistent in sharing and educating others. It is our duty, especially to the younger generation. Determined to serve, Black Canadians rallied for equality when it was not easy to do back then and today. They overcame and blazed a path. The formation of the No. 2 Construction Battalion, CEF, is an example of the strength and courage of the Black Canadian spirit. Not only did these men serve their country, they also contributed to their community in many ways beyond their service. Truly a remarkable legacy. 2024 marks the 108th anniversary of the formation of the No. 2 Construction Battalion, one of Canada's largest segregated all-Black units that paved the way to a future of diversity as demonstrated in today's armed forces. We pay tribute to the memory of the late Senator Ruck and advocates such as the late Captain George Borden, the welcoming town of Pictou, and all those who have a commitment to keeping the legacy alive. We take this opportunity to thank the Minister of National Defense, Honor Bill Blair, for his commitment and dedication to the recommendations of the National Apology. We also salute the outgoing commander of the 5th Canadian Division, Brigadier General Stéphane Messon, and the outgoing commander of the 4th Engineering Support Unit, Lieutenant Colonel Adam Poirier, for your support over the past few years, and look forward to working closely with the incoming command team in moving this important work forward through the Canadian Armed Forces. I am also glad to share that the work with the Professional Conduct and Culture, National Defense Department, and Veterans Affairs continues to build capacity. A special thank you to Mr. Russell Gross, Executive Director of the Black Cultural Center, and his staff for their efforts in making this an event to happen every year. Mr. Barry Pitcher, for your allyship, and to the town of Pictou for the welcoming spirit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mervyn. Now, to share some history of the battalion and reflections, it is my pleasure to invite the Ruck family representative, which I thought that was me, apparently not, Honorary Colonel Douglas Ruck, son of the late Senator Calvin Ruck and father of Lindsay and Jacqueline Ruck. Senator Calvin Ruck is the author of the book, The Black Battalion, 1916 to 1920, Canada's Best Kept Military Secret. Please welcome Honorary Colonel Douglas Ruck.
Thank you, Lindsay. Well, I guess I know where I stand now in the pecking order. First of all, I want to say welcome to our honored guests, to all those in attendance, and to all those who have joined online. Thank you for being part of this, another chapter in the history of the Black Battalion. It has been said that those who do not learn from history are destined to repeat their mistakes. Sadly, we're seeing that unfold in real time, given recent events. But it's also equally true that if you don't know your history, you're destined not to honor or to respect your heroes or those who have gone before and opened doors or paved the way for those who followed. That has been the fate of the Black Battalion. They were unknown, unheralded, did not receive the recognition they already deserved. That has been the change, but there remains work to be done. Even though their own country did not want them, as noted in the program, they were told this is a white man's war. We'll call you if we need you. They fought for the right to fight. Eventually, they were given that right to serve on behalf of their country, but with pickaxes and shovels. They occupied a segregated battalion. They occupied a segregated space in a world war. They did not fight seeking special acknowledgement. They did not join the CEF, asking to be lauded for their activities. All they wanted was to be recognized as Canadians. But this country said no. Not only are you not Canadians, you really qualify as men. They were seen and treated as being subservient to others, to do the menial tasks, not to be part of this country. But nonetheless they did. They stood up for what they believed in. They did not see themselves as heroes, but they believed in themselves. Because of what they did, we are here today. Because of what they did, I have the honor to wear this uniform. Keep in mind, if it had not been the Black Battalion, we very well might not ever have had the number of racialized and marginalized people serving in the current military. The numbers are still not where they need to be. But absent the battalion, I dare say it would have been much worse and fewer and much fewer. As it states in the program, I'm also to speak upon reflections. When it comes to reflections for the Ruck family, my daughters Lindsay, Jacqueline, my mother Joyce Ruck, who's here with us today, my wife Valerie, it's a bittersweet reflection. As Mervyn mentioned, we speak of certain individuals now as the late individuals. That still hurts. We miss our father, and will continue to do so. When I have reflections, I think back to a time when he, long before there was a commemoration ceremony, he'd be sitting at the dining room table, writing, putting down the history, well before the internet, any electronic means of information, transcribing by hand, making notes of it. Now, in later years, my father was stricken with Alzheimer's, a very cruel illness. And sometimes he used to take those who, for lack of a better word, least deserve it. And yet, he never forgot the Black Battalion. He never faltered in his faith. One of my strongest memories of my father and my family is when Jacqueline and Lindsay would come home from university. And they would go in the bedroom when he was bedridden. And they would sing hymns and spirituals. And those voices would fill the house. A very special time in the life of a man who had done so much for so many and asked nothing in return. He didn't seek public acclaim. He didn't ask for applause. He wanted to make a difference for all of us. As a young man, my father became a member of the CN Railway as a porter. And as a porter, he came in contact with other black men. And by the way, as most of you probably know, work as a porter was a job that for the most part was designated for black men. And by chance, members of the No. 2 Construction Battalion, who were now veterans, went from serving what was a subservient role, a seasoned subservient role for the First World War, to occupying a subservient role in civil society. And they began to talk to him about the No. 2 Construction Battalion. He had never heard it before, but he never wanted to lose that information. And he was determined he would record it. And for the better part of his life, he began to document about the Black Battalion, keep a record of it, allow us to learn. It took a lot of time, a lot of years, a lot of effort, but he did it. For many times, when he went through this work, it was very lonely. There were those who told him, "You have no need to do this." Why? Because it was felt that to raise that part of history, that unattractive part in history, would cause dissent, disharmony. Well, my father persevered because he felt it was a story that needed to be told. So along with the Black Cultural Center, they made it happen. And at one point, he made a trip to Pictou. And there he met the then Mayor, Mayor LeBlanc. And they tried to figure out a way of commemorating what those men had done. They had been stationed in this town during the First World War. And how do we commemorate that? And they agreed to hold a ceremony on the waterfront. And people came from across this country, from the United States. It was a glorious day, a day of heat, ebbs rain, and the waterfront was filled. And I say with all due respect to the town of Pictou, that was probably, since the day of the battalion, the most black people that had ever been in this town at one time. It was a remarkable day, a historic day. And as Merv mentioned, Pictou has become an ally, a part of that. Mayor Ryan is here today, and it's so good to see the head of this town, the officer of this town, as part of this ceremony. That was part of my father's desire, that others would pick up that mantle and carry it forward. And it's being done, and we are so very thankful. So when we talk about the battalion, we talk about what has been accomplished, but we talk about what needs to be done. 31 years. That means that there are many who are no longer with us, as I mentioned. Merv gave a few of the names. But there are young people as well coming along, replacing those who have come before. So why do we do this? For my father, it was to make sure that we knew the story of the battalion, that his family knew the story of the battalion, that your families knew the story of the battalion, that all Canadians knew the story of the battalion. That was his objective. So why do we come here every year? Why do we gather every year? Because despite the national apology, despite the inroads that have been made, it's a history, it's a story that is still very fragile. If we don't continue to speak about this, if we don't continue to stand up and herald Number 2 Construction Battalion, that memory may fade. And if it fades, then for those who have gone before, we live a great disservice. But even more so, if it fades, we do a disservice to the men of the Number 2 Construction Battalion. They deserve to be remembered. Your presence here helps to remember them. Thank you. Thank you so very, very much for being part, not just of this ceremony, but part of the legacy of the Number 2 Construction Battalion. Thank you very much.
And I'll just add to that, I want to thank Honorary Colonel Ruck for acknowledging my grandmother for 2 reasons. 1, because we would hear about it on the car ride home if it did not happen. And 2, because she is 94 years old, and she still makes sure to honor these. 2 years ago, on July 9th, 2022, in Truro, Nova Scotia, a significant milestone in Canadian history was marked. On that day, the Prime Minister, on behalf of the Government of Canada, offered an official apology to the members of the Number 2 Construction Battalion. It was a remarkable day of change in the progression of the legacy of the Number 2 Construction Battalion. At this time, I would like to invite Ms. Sylvia Paris-Drummond to the stage to offer some reflections of the apology. Sylvia's father was a member of the Number 2 Construction Battalion. Please welcome Sylvia.
Thank you, Lindsay. folks hear me okay? Yes. Thank you. So it is indeed an honor and a pleasure to have the opportunity in the context of the apology to give a little bit of context in terms of personalizing to my father and a broader context in terms of the contribution from our kind of family voice perspective. Let's see if I can get this right and still read. I acknowledge our ancestors on whose shoulders we are perched and thank them for their resilience over generations and throughout our challenging history. It is because of them we survive and we thrive. I acknowledge and thank Calvin W. Ruck, whose spirit must permeate all stories and memories of the No. 2 Construction Battalion. I thank him for his vision, determination, and persistence. What I want to share in the story includes a quest for freedom and justice, which is rooted deeply in family and community pride and intergenerational connectedness. You would see the picture on the cover of the program, and in the center of that picture is Private Joseph Alexander Paris, my father, a handsome young man, 17 years old when he entered into the battalion. And I wanted to draw our attention to that, as particularly as we make our connection with the apology, and shout out to Robert Downey, who I see there, I was talking to earlier, who were among the folks who were part of that advisory committee for the apology, and also among the many folks in the Black Cultural Center of Nova Scotia itself, who made a movement that, when I say this, I think our community people who are here particularly will get it. My ability to be able to talk about the story of the battalion broadly was offered because, for whatever reason that created that experience, my father was able to be named. They could name Joseph Alexander Paris. For the folks that are on this photo, and many others, they were not named at that origins time. But thanks to the work of many here, and as I said, the work and the leadership of organizations, I'm sure now that everyone on this particular photo is able to be named. And you can go online and you can hover over the battalion, larger photo, and see the names of people. And for those of us in our communities who so often when we greet and say a name, we start the conversation about, are you the Gordon from Guysborough County? Right. Are you the Paris from Amherst? Are you the Paris from Chorrell? And so on. So that, in terms of a community dialogue, is important. But of course, it's also important because of pride and dignity, right? And knowing the striving that people made at that time in order to be able to fight the fight. So what I've chosen to do today is just to read a bit of an excerpt from a chapter that is in a book, Speak Up, War and Community, that has a section that talks a bit about the battalion. So I'm just going to give a little bit of that. And Lindsay, I'm going to keep the time. So on July 25th, 1916, my father, as I said, at the age of 15, he would not be 18 until another 9 months, enlisted in the No. 2 Construction Black Battalion. He would have made the journey from Sandpoint, Mulgrave, to Pictou, New Glasgow, Nova Scotia, to join the Canadian Expeditionary Force, the Labour Battalion, which recruited African Canadians from across the country. Imagine a 17-year-old boy, his brother, talking with animation and verve about the war while doing their chores, perhaps working a field crop or tending farm animals. They are talking about enlisting and wanting, indeed needing, to fight for their country. Maybe they later speak with their father, who tries to explain to them how their race would affect their dreams. Maybe their mother, who was not just my grandmother in a name, but also a midwife in those times and played a very important role. Maybe in speaking with her, she would be trying to dissuade them because she did not want them to leave, not wanting to lose her sons to war. Maybe their mother's pleas was behind the reason why the two young men enlist separately, weeks apart in two separate locations. Perhaps it was in their blood, as the saying goes, this desire to support the cause for freedom. My grandfather, Charles L. Paris, was of the Black Loyalist lineage. He came and fought to be present in a country where he thought he could realize his freedom. We won't go down the road of discussion about the denial of grants and land in this conversation. The fight to fight was rooted in survival. Bruce MacDonald wrote about my father, and who he referenced as Joe. And I just wanted to read this little excerpt from World War II Veterans, Guysborough County, an article that appeared in June 2014. Like many young men of his generation, Joe was excited at the prospect of serving overseas after the outbreak of the war in Europe. His African Nova Scotian heritage, however, presented an obstacle, as the majority of infantries refused to accept black recruits. This was the case even though policy was otherwise. I am very grateful to Bruce for involving me in the writing of this blog. I learned a lot from our discussions, my research with him, and my self-reflection about my father and the battalion. The creation of the battalion is an example of Black community agency and resilience. The community used the tools that are still in play today, such as leadership in the church and community organizing, and as Truro became a recruiting hub for the Black populations. For example, Reverend William White, who became the chaplain of the battalion, advocated for Black Nova Scotian men to be involved in the war. The role of a construction unit was a dangerous one. It supported the front lines, building roads and bridges and defusing landmines. Personally, I am filled with questions that I would have loved to have asked my daddy, such as, what did it feel like to sail overseas? Did you see your brother, my Uncle Bill, after departing the ship? Did you miss your parents? These and many other questions I was not able to ask for a number of reasons. The most significant one was that it was not available for us in the public education system. There has been much change, and there continues to be need for change, which we have acknowledged. In this little excerpt from the full chapter, I wanted to share the experiences of family, the engagement of community in the struggle for the Black Battalion, and the valuing of the folks who have and who continue to contribute, so that where we're at today, and we acknowledge the apology and the recommendation going forward from those, will continue to be more public, so that the knowledge of the battalion and its contributions, and indeed the possibilities of what may exist for today for all of us, are easily available and readily shareable. Once again, I'm appreciative of the opportunity to bring a bit of voice from a personal perspective, family story. I'm appreciative of those who sat here in terms of leadership and feel a deep accountability to continue to make change. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. We've now come to the point in our program where we offer an act of remembrance, and I'd like to invite Sergeant Craig Smith to guide this portion of the ceremony.
Good morning. I am going to go through the honor roll, followed by the last post. So finishing the honor roll, if we would all stand for the last post, then for the observance of a moment of silence, followed by the reveille, and then the act of remembrance. So, members of number 2 who died in service to their king and country. In remembrance, Private Clarence Ash, Truro, Nova Scotia. Private Edward Augustus, Liverpool, Nova Scotia. Private Percy Aldebert Berryman, Arcadia, Nova Scotia. Private John Blizzard, St. John, New Brunswick. Private William Boone, Jenkins, Alberta. Private Andrew James Brown, Bradford, Ontario. Lance Corporal George Dean Brown, Barbados. Sapper Charles Henry Bryant, Hamilton, Ontario. Private Vincent Carvery, Affigville, Nova Scotia. Private Early Cooper, Detroit, Michigan. Private Arthur Benson Cromwell, Weymouth Falls, Nova Scotia. Private Charles Henry Cromwell, Danvers, Nova Scotia. Private Sidney David, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Private James Doughton, Barbados. Private Thomas Goffigan, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Private Belfield Elliott Hall, Barbados. Private Major Harston, Winnipeg, Manitoba. Private Edward Lionel Hay, Trinidad. Private Michael Jackson, Glace Bay, Nova Scotia. Private William Jackson, Antigonish, Nova Scotia. Private William Charles Jackson, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Private William Kellum, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Private John Lambert, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Private Walter James Lucas, Dresden, Ontario. Private John Mansfield, Bridgetown, Nova Scotia. Private Aubrey Mitchell, British West Indies. Private John Mitchell, Ypsilanti, Michigan. Private Stephen Bratton Morris, Detroit, Michigan. Private Chester Pennell, Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. Private Reuben Alexander Smith, Weymouth Falls, Nova Scotia. Private Charles Somm, Affigville, Nova Scotia. Sapper Nathaniel Stewart, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Sergeant Charles Stewart, Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. Private George Sylvie, New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. Private Edward Scythe Washington, Fredericton, New Brunswick. Sapper James Douglas Wims, Salt Springs Islands, British Columbia. Private Robert A. Wildman, Montreal, Quebec. Private Sylvester William, Detroit, Michigan. Private Tillman McKinley Williams, Detroit, Michigan. And Private William Wilson, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Would you please rise for the playing of the last post? Thank you. Act of remembrance. They shall grow not old, as we who are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. Thank you. You may be seated.
The late retired Captain George Borden, who you've heard mentioned here a few times this morning, was noted as being a champion of Black Canadian military history and worked to support the research of Calvin Ruck. He was a decorated member of the Royal Canadian Air Force, a writer, and a poet. And one of the poems he wrote was entitled Black Soldier's Lament. Please now enjoy this audio presentation of the reading of the Black Soldier's Lament, which has been narrated by Mr. Borden's brother, Walter Borden.
The bugle called, and forth we went, to serve the crown, our backs far bent, and build whate'er that must be done, but ne'er to fire an angry gun. No heroes we, no, nay, not one. With deep lament we did our job, despite the shame our manhood robbed. We built and fixed again, to prove our worth as proud black men, and hasten sure the Kaiser's end. From Scotia port to Seaport Square, across to France, the conflict there. At Ville-la-Joux and Place Perron, for God and King to right the wrong. The number 2, 600 strong. Stripped to the waist and sweated chest, midday's reprieve, much needed rest. We dug and hauled and lifted high, from trenches deep towards the sky. Non-fighting troops, and yet we die. The peace restored, the battle won. Black sweat and toil had beat bottom. Black blood was spilled, black bodies maimed. For medals brave, no black was named. Yet proud were we, our pride unshamed. But time will bring forth other wars, then give to us more daring chores, that we might prove our courage strong, preserve the right, repel the wrong, and proud we'll sing the battle song.
He wasn't in the room with us, but with that voice, it certainly felt like he was. That was powerful. At this time in the program, it is very fitting that we lay wreaths as a symbolic gesture, honoring those who have made significant contributions and sacrifices. So, as I call your name, please come to the front and lay your wreath. And I believe the 5th Canadian Division Composite Band will be back. Yes? Okay, okay, perfect. So first we have the Honourable Sean Fraser, Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities of Canada. Associate Deputy Minister of Veterans Affairs Canada, Christine McDowell. Assistant Commissioner Dennis Daly, RCMP H Division. Mervyn Broom, President of the Black Cultural Society. Honorary Colonel Douglas Ruck. Mr. Barry Pitcher, Commissionaires Nova Scotia. Comrade Alana McQuaid, New Glasgow Legion, Normandy Branch 34. It's now time for some of our distinguished guests to bring remarks. So first, I'd like to welcome the Honourable Sean Fraser, Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities of Canada.
Hello and welcome everyone. It's an absolute privilege to join you here today to commemorate the contributions of the No. 2 Construction Battalion. And of course, it's appropriate that we're gathered here in the town of Pictou, the original home to the No. 2 Construction Battalion. Before I begin, let me extend my gratitude to members of the Canadian Armed Forces who've joined us today and members of the community as well. Your attendance demonstrates the respect to which we all owe the No. 2 Construction Battalion, and to commemorate their service and do justice to those who didn't receive the hero's welcome they deserved when they first came back. There's a long and proud history of the Canadian Armed Forces in this country and deserves to be celebrated. From the contributions at Vimy Ridge, where Brigadier General A.E. Ross said, "In those few minutes I witnessed the birth of a nation," to the service in the Second World War, the Korean conflict, many peacekeeping missions, and more recently those who served in Afghanistan. But not all heroes have been treated equally over the course of Canada's history. And I can't help but reflect on my time coming through the education system here in the community from which I came, seemingly knowing more about American history than I did my own. We learned so many lessons about Martin Luther King Jr., but very few about Viola Desmond. I tended to hear more about Nelson Mandela in the school system than I did about the No. 2 Construction Battalion. The examples go on, but I think it's a reflection of the fact that we often celebrated the history of people who look like me. It's not a coincidence that I knew growing up that my ancestors arrived 250 years ago, just a few minutes from here, but never knew until I was an adult that the African Nova Scotian community in this country and this province was here for 400 years. Black history is Canadian history. African Nova Scotian history is Canadian history. And it's through events like that we're celebrating today that we can actually do justice to the memory of those who history has too often forgotten. But recognizing those who served doesn't happen by coincidence. It won't continue without effort. It's essential that we shine a light on those who've actually brought this history to our attention. The contributions of Calvin Ruck in particular, I'm so pleased to see the Ruck family represented today. The contributions he made allow us to gather to properly honor those who served their country. As Honorary Colonel Douglas Ruck mentioned, they fought not only for their country, but for their right to do so, and in doing so, defended the rights of every Canadian to be treated equally. This is a fundamental tenet of what it means to be Canadian to me. The right to equal treatment before the law. The right to be free from discrimination on the basis of the color of your skin. We too often take for granted something that seems so obvious, but certainly a little more than 100 years ago, it didn't seem obvious to those who were excluded from service, who put their hand up, who wanted to volunteer to a cause worth fighting for, but were denied that opportunity. Treated not only with the refusal to have the opportunity to serve, but racism and discrimination, being told we didn't want a checkerboard army. Think about how offensive that is to someone who wants to contribute their skills to a cause that is worth fighting for, on which we all have depended. It's important that we continue to acknowledge the service of those who have built this country, including the members of the No. 2 Construction Battalion. I'm so pleased to share that through partnership with the Black Cultural Centre, Veterans Affairs Canada, and communities who will be acknowledging the history of the No. 2 Construction Battalion, we'll be supporting 5 new projects and the amount of nearly $125,000, including community events, including new exhibits, including new memorials, and importantly, the kind of research that Calvin Ruck did on his own volition, and now supported financially by the federal government to ensure that we can capture these stories in our history books. We have to make the effort to ensure that our heroes will never be forgotten. But I see that effort in spades here today with those who've taken time out of their weekend to come honor the contributions of the members of the No. 2 Construction Battalion. We can't assume this will continue without continuing to show up. So I want to say thank you in particular to the members of the Black Cultural Centre, for whom this is certainly important work. But I want to just extend on behalf of the Government of Canada my gratitude, because the work is not important just to the members who showed up today, the Canadian Armed Forces, the volunteers at the Black Cultural Centre, but indeed everyone in the province of Nova Scotia and the country we all call home. Thank you. It's an honor to be with you here today.
Thank you, Minister. And I'm going to ask the Honourable Twyla Gross to stay standing, a Minister of African Nova Scotian Affairs, to bring a few words.
Honored guests, members of the Black Cultural Center for Nova Scotia, and members of the number 2 Construction Battalion Planning Committee, and all gathered here today. It is with profound respect and deep humility that I stand before you on this day of remembrance on behalf of Premier Tim Houston and the government of Nova Scotia. Today, we come together to honor the strong spirit and important legacy of the number 2 Construction Battalion. This remarkable unit is a powerful example of bravery, strength, and the constant fight for justice. 108 years ago, in the face of racial discrimination and against the harsh winds of systemic racism, over 800 brave souls drawn from Nova Scotia, across Canada, the United States, and the British West Indies rallied together to form Canada's first and only all-Black battalion during the First World War. This battalion, formed right here in Pictou, was not just a military unit. It was a fierce challenge to the status quo and a clear declaration that valor knows no color. The formation of the number 2 Construction Battalion was not born of preference, but of necessity. These men, eager to serve the nation that was theirs as much as anyone else's, were initially rebuffed, told that the battle for freedom was a white man's war. Yet, they did not relent. Instead, they organized, they advocated, and they triumphed in securing their right to wear this nation's uniform. In doing so, they did not just fight for Canada. They fought for the dignity of every Black Canadian, and they laid the groundwork for the diverse and inclusive armed services we see today. That's why, as we stand here in Pictou, let us not only remember the battalion for their service, but also honor their legacy of advocacy, which echoes throughout the decades. 2 years ago, our nation took a step toward reconciliation with a formal apology for the injustices faced by these men due to systemic racism, a long overdue recognition. Today, as we have laid wreaths and bow our heads in respect, we do more than just recall these historical facts. We recommit ourselves to the principles for which the number 2 Construction Battalion stood. We affirm our dedication for a future where equality and rights are unquestionable rights guaranteed to all, regardless of ethnic, culture, or religious background. To the families of those brave men, to the educators who keep their stories alive, and to all who continue to fight against discrimination and for equality, I offer my deepest gratitude. Your efforts to ensure that the flame of justice ignited by the number 2 Construction Battalion continues to burn brightly, guiding us through our present and leading us to our future. This memorial is a testament for future generations, inspiring all of us to carry forward the battalion's legacy of courage, resiliency, unity, and unyielding pursuit of equality. May the memory of the No. 2 Construction Battalion forever inspire us, and may their legacy guide us towards a fairer, more inclusive world. We will remember them.
Thank you, Minister. I'd now like to invite Mayor Jim Ryan to bring his remarks.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. Descendants of the No. 2 Battalion soldiers, Minister Fraser, Minister Gross, Assistant Commissioner Daly, Captain Junor, special guests, members of the Ruck family, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the town of Pictou. And for those who were here last year, you'll notice we changed the weather around this year by about, I think, by about 20 degrees, to tell you the truth. I also wanted to take the opportunity to thank the St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church for the use of this beautiful facility for this important celebration. It's once again my honor to represent the town of Pictou in commemorating the anniversary of the formation of the No. 2 Construction Battalion, and to remember those brave men of strength for their patriotism and determination. Anytime the town of Pictou is mentioned as the initial home of Canada's only black battalion, I personally experience an immense sense of place and pride, because these soldiers are not only remembered for service to their country, but equally as important, for their determined battle against the prevalent racist attitudes of those times. The recent national apology for the unacceptable treatment they received was long overdue, and we must all do our best to share this important part of our history with all Canadians, especially our young people. I'm so very pleased to see other Nova Scotian communities choosing to recognize the No. 2 in unique ways, and I look forward to visiting those new sites in the future. Although they spent only a few months here in our little town before moving to Truro, the soldiers of the No. 2 Construction Battalion will continue to be remembered and honored among other brave Pictonians who served their countries with so much courage. This ceremony of remembrance, initiated 31 years ago through the efforts of Dr. Calvin Ruck and my predecessors, has become, and we hope will remain, an important annual event for our community. On behalf of the town, I would like to thank the Black Cultural Society, the Ruck family, Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada, Department of Veterans Affairs, for their continued efforts in keeping this important part of our history alive. Again, thanks everyone for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd now like to invite Assistant Commissioner Dennis Daly, RCMP-H Division.
Good morning, everyone. Descendants, distinguished guests, Minister Fraser, Minister Gross, Mayor Ryan, Mr. Broom, Honorary Colonel Ruck, Brigadier General MacDonald. Thank you to the Canadian Armed Forces, the Black Cultural Centre, and the organizers of today's event. Some of you are probably aware that the Nova Scotia RCMP has played a role in the No. 2 Construction Battalion's tribute since its inception 31 years ago. We're pleased to be part of this event again this year. I'm truly honored to be here this morning with community and descendants. As always, this tribute gives us an opportunity to acknowledge the No. 2 Construction Battalion's contribution to Canadian history, and specifically to the history of the Canadian military. Both the RCMP and the Canadian Armed Forces share similar values and have worked together in the protection of Canadians and in the interests of Canada, both home and abroad. This is exactly what the members of the No. 2 Construction Battalion did. Because they weren't allowed to fight on the front line due to the color of their skin, building roads and ensuring adequate and clean water supply were among the battalion's critical roles to support their colleagues in the combat zone. And we know members of the battalion often worked in unprotected areas. Some were killed or wounded while representing our country and backing up their fellow Canadians. For the No. 2 Construction Battalion, the yearning for inclusion was real. And this is also true for African Canadians who've served and continue to serve in the RCMP. I'm always humbled by an overwhelming respect for African Canadians who've been, like the members of the No. 2 Construction Battalion, trailblazers inside and outside of our organization. Many of you have heard of Shelley Peters, currently the RCMP Deputy Chief Human Resource Officer in Ottawa, and daughter to Major Walter Peters, who was honored this past week by the Royal Nova Scotia International Tattoo for his service to the RCF. Retired Superintendent Ted Upshaw, the first Black commissioned officer in the force. Chief Superintendent Craig Gibson, the first African Canadian commanding officer in the history of the RCMP. And my friend, Sergeant Craig Smith, a pioneer a pioneer with the work he has done to educate not only myself, but also employees and many others on African Canadian experience at the RCMP locally and nationally. These are just 4 examples of RCMP officers of African descent who've made a lasting impression on our organization and our province. Their collective successes can be linked to those who came before, including the men of the No. 2 Construction Battalion. And their legacies will no doubt influence those who follow in their footprints, such as Corporal Aaron Dillon, the first recipient from the RCMP of the King Charles Coronation Medal, and New Glasgow's own Sergeant Glenn Bonvie, who's in charge of the Northeast Nova Major Crime Unit. You may have heard that this September, I'll be apologizing to African Nova Scotians and all people of African descent living in Nova Scotia for the historic use of street checks and other harmful interactions. I know this apology is long overdue, but I hope the community can see that we're working to rebuild trust and relationships with the Black community across the province. On behalf of the Nova Scotia RCMP, I wish you all the best today's celebrations honoring the brave men of the No. 2 Construction Battalion, and I thank you for inviting me to participate. Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, we have Councillor Hal Davison, who is representing the town of Amherst.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. And first of all, I'd like to express my most sincere appreciation for today's organizing committee to allow me to make this brief statement today respecting an event that we will be having in the town of Amherst on August 3rd. 2 years ago, the local Legion branch approached the town of Amherst requesting that the town-owned space next to the town hall be designated as a memorial park with the intention of erecting an Afghanistan war memorial for the Canadian soldiers who lost their lives in Afghanistan. Our council quickly agreed, but with the provision that the space be inclusive, an inclusive memorial space with the No. 2 Construction Battalion in mind. Amherst contributed at least 20 men to the No. 2 Construction Battalion. And we also have a large number of African Nova Scotians living in our community who are direct descendants of those for those who served in the battalion. I personally am a descendant of 3 members, a great-grandfather and 2 great-uncles, one who eventually was ordained and served as a minister at the Highland AME Church in Amherst. I'd like to bring to your attention in your program, in the back page, where we are now in a position to unveil a No. 2 Construction Battalion monument at a ceremony to be held August 3rd. The town is working closely with the Black Cultural Center, Mr. Russell Gross, with whom we are greatly indebted to. We are also working with the Cumberland African Nova Scotia Association and the local Legion branch, who have and we've been very, very successful in securing funding from Veterans Affairs to obtain a monument and provide a fitting ceremony. Now, the purpose of me standing here today is to extend an open invitation to all in attendance today to this event. We will commence August 3rd with a play in the morning highlighting the personal stories from direct descendants, accompanied by a well-known music group, Said Marty and Dave, Marty Williams from the Pictou County area that many people are aware of, and that will be followed by a luncheon. After that, we will have a military parade to the Memorial Park and an unveiling of the monument. In the late afternoon and evening, Kansas will be hosting several activities at the Amherst Stadium, inclusive of musical groups in celebration of Emancipation Day. So please, save the date, August 3rd in Amherst, and we will contribute to highlight the legacy and continue to highlight the legacy of the No. 2 Construction Battalion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor. As part of the National Apology in 2022, the idea was crafted by members of the National Advisory Committee to have a legacy quilt commissioned by the Canadian Armed Forces to honor the legacy of the No. 2 Construction Battalion. Today we are pleased to welcome Brigadier General John MacDonald, Deputy Commander, Canadian 5th Division, to come forward to make this important presentation. We are grateful for Advisory Committee members Robert Downey and Sheila White, who advocated for the idea, and to Mr. David Woods of the Black Artist Network of Nova Scotia for his leadership with the Vale Road Quilters in bringing the legacy of No. 2 to life in form of this quilt. Please welcome Brigadier General John MacDonald.
Thanks, Lindsay. Minister Fraser, Minister Gross, Mayor Ryan, Honorary Colonel Ruck, Mr. Broom, and Mr. Russell Gross at the back of the room there. Distinguished guests, honored veterans, members of the Canadian Armed Forces, and members of the community, good day. Today we gather, as we have annually for many years, to commemorate and remember those brave Black Nova Scotians who gave freely of themselves to serve our nation in the Great War. These men of No. 2 Construction Battalion volunteered from across the country and, as we heard this morning, beyond, to fight for Canadians regardless of race, creed, or religion. As we sit assembled here together, let us honor the bravery, sacrifice, and unwavering resolve of the Black Battalion. It's been said, but only a few years ago, many of us gathered in Truro for the national apology on behalf of the Government of Canada in recognition of historic wrongs, and in good faith that our Canadian soldiers would be honored and remembered. During the consultation with the National Advisory Council, the Black Cultural Centre for Nova Scotia, and the community writ large, a plan was made for the creation of a quilt to be given to the descendants of those soldiers and the African Nova Scotian community as an act of remembrance and a commitment to recognize the ongoing efforts to ensure the Canadian Armed Forces of today reflects the values we hold as Canadians. The presentation of this quilt does not mark the end of our commitment, but is only an important milestone on our path forward together. This quilt, titled Tribute, is the result of years of cooperation and consultation and months of hard work. Work began with the Black Artist Network of Nova Scotia with Mr. David Woods, who brought forward a vision and a team to create this quilt that you see here today. And if you remember anything today, this is the important part. Indeed, the entire team of the Vale Quilters deserve our utmost respect in breathing life into this work. And I would ask that we take a moment to show our appreciation to Mila Borden, Melinda Clayton-Patterson, Heather Cromwell, and Heather McKenzie. You have honored the men of No. 2 Construction Battalion with this incredible work of art, and it is exactly that, a work of art. We know that through the hard work over these last few years, the memory and legacy of No. 2 Construction Battalion will live on. It lives on amongst the soldiers of 4 Engineer Support Regiment, who perpetuate its lineage. It will live on in the memories of all who attended the apology in Truro. It will live on in the memories and hearts of the descendants of Number 2 Construction Battalion, and now, thanks to you, the legacy and memory will be forever preserved in the hearts and minds of those who see the tribute, whether at its home in the Black Cultural Centre for Nova Scotia or on display across the country. Thank you.
And we mentioned David Woods provided leadership on this project, and we're thrilled that he's here with us today. So I'm going to invite him now to share a few words on the project. Please welcome Mr. David Woods.
My partner in crime. It is always an honor to be a conduit to representing my community, Black Nova Scotians, that I'm passionately in love with. And when we got the call from the National Committee, I want to give honor to the National Apology Committee for recognizing that an art piece that lives and is from the community can make a great contribution to the carrying on of memory. And coincidentally, a quilt, which has such connections to family, community, history, Underground Railroad quilts that helped us get to freedom, and for recognizing that this would be a living legacy that will last forever. And for Robert Downey, when the idea came to do a quilt and somebody wanted an American, he said, hey, I know some people down home that can make quilts. And the Vale Quilters, who I've been working with since 1997, and who are actually having a show that's touring Canada currently, The Secret Codes, currently at the Toronto Museum. I've had the privilege in my life to journey to all the Black communities when I was very young, fell in love with the stories, fell in love with the culture, and have spent my time writing, creating art, plays, etc. Mr. Ruck was one of my favorite visits, and I'm so glad to tell you that I heard that your mom's here, Joyce. I haven't seen her in years. On Walker Street, I'd go visit him while he was doing his gardening. His little flowers in front of him, and we'd chat about so many things, about his family in Sydney. And to see the commitment he had to the number 2, to making sure, I remember him telling me, how it came about that he would be listening to all these men telling all these stories on the trains. And he was so moved by that experience, he felt he had to do something. I really connected with him on that because that was the same feeling I had when I visited all the Black communities. I had to tell their stories because it lived in me. So I want to thank the Vale Quilters. We've had many journeys, and the fact that we're still together for almost 30 years now, representing our communities all across Canada. And I think we didn't mention everybody, so I'll mention Marlene Dorrington and Shirley McKenzie, Heather Cromwell, Debbie Jordan, who is still active. They also just did another commission for the Stellarton Public Library that is on permanent display. So they're getting famous. And I also wanted to, this went through many permutations. I started with about 10 designs that I shared with the quilters. They narrowed it down to 4, and that was sent to the National Committee. The National Committee then chose a particular design, and then I came to the quilters and said, make that one. Not all the things were possible, so we had to make different changes. And different people contributed. Melinda Clayton Patterson was another person that she actually lives in Winnipeg. And then we finally had to come down to this piece that's called Tribute. So I want to, because it's very moving, we missed the deadline 3 times. And in talking to Captain James Lejeune, who was a real benefactor for us, really helped me out. He said, well, if you don't deliver it on the 28th, you're not getting no money. Because the military don't pay you until you deliver. And we done been buying all kinds of stuff. So anyway, it was last Friday, drove to New Brunswick, delivered the quilt, and ended a process that actually had begun almost a year prior to that. So I'll turn it over to the person who did most of the final quilts. I ordered her to change so many things, he didn't want me in her house no more. But Mila Borden, great friend of mine from many years, and who was the main quilt maker of Tribute.
First of all, I'd like to recognize all the dignitaries here. I don't know how to acknowledge you all, but welcome and thank you. And to David and the committee that did this, that recommended this quilt, I'd like to say thank you for the opportunity. And to the Vale Quilters, Shirley, everybody says Vale Road Quilters. We're the Vale Quilters, and I have to get that name changed. We have to get our name changed. But I'm just going to talk about the quilt making. It went through several metamorphoses. And I'm not going to keep you here long, but the colors. First of all, the colors. Okay, I had all the colors down. David said, oh, it's kind of bright. So I thought he meant to dull it. So I started another one and turned all the colors over, like some of the bright ones, turned them over, toned it down. Okay, wasn't bright enough again. The lettering, did the lettering. Oh, it wasn't quite the right lettering. Okay, so can you get the design of the lettering? So he did. And then the men, I had some different color soldiers, and they were like in fabric. Oh no, that color's too different. Oh no, that would never work. Oh no, that, okay, well, let me do something. So we tried the painting on the canvas. So he said, could you get it on the quilt if I get it on the canvas? Okay, got it on the canvas. Barely got it on the canvas. Through 15 needles, sewing machine needles, okay. Up at 2 o'clock in the morning, quilting. Oh, it was endless. But we met, I shouldn't say the deadline, but we met the final deadline, the ultimate deadline. David kept saying, when? I need a date. I said, I'm working hard as soon as it's ready. But I worked the last night, it was till 5:30 in the morning. David came at 8 to pick it up. So anyway, thank you for the opportunity. And even though it was only 2 people that put it all together, a lot of people had some work during it. Okay? So thank you very much, and hope you enjoy it.
Thank you. It really is beautiful to see all the different ways that people have found to honor the number 2. For my grandfather, for myself, it was through the written word, but there are songs, there are poems, there's this beautiful quilt, so it's beautiful people are using their strengths to honor these men. Speaking of a form of art, we now have the 5th Canadian Division Composite Band, who's joining us again to perform a musical selection, so you can look at the quilts and listen to the music. it's now time for our keynote address, and I'll be brief with the intro so we can get right to our keynote address. Kevin Junor is the Executive Director for KRJ Corps. He has an exceptional career in the public sector, community, and the military. Kevin is retired Deputy Superintendent from the Ministry of the Solicitor General, completing a 34-year career with the Ontario Public Service. Before joining the Ministry of the Solicitor General, Kevin held other positions in the Ontario Public Service, including Change Management Consultant and Senior Business Advisor. Kevin was a member of the National Apology Advisory Committee. He has chaired and been a member of a number of boards, and he also chaired the Policing Advisory Council responsible for restorative justice dispute resolutions. Please welcome Captain Kevin Junor.
I'm just checking to see if I can do it without my glasses. But I think age is going to win. Distinguished guests, Minister Fraser, Minister Gross, the leaders of the Black Cultural Center, Black Cultural Society, my friend Russell Gross, the Executive Director of the Black Cultural Center, General, Colonel, Lieutenant Colonels, Mayor, Chief Warrant Officers, members of the Canadian Armed Forces, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. I'm humbled, I'm blessed, I'm honored to speak to you for a few minutes about my relationship with the No. 2 Construction Battalion. When you go to church on Christmas Sunday, you know that the pastor is going to speak about the birth of Jesus Christ. And then the pastor is going to tell you how you can apply that to your life. Well, on a day like this, when we descend to historic Pictou, Nova Scotia, that has become the place that enshrined the history of No. 2, a place where anyone can visit and see the monument dedicated to the men of No. 2 and get an opportunity to share in the rich legacy of one of Canada's best kept secrets. On this day, you better expect to hear stories of No. 2 and further understand that there will be a call to action. We've had a number of speakers, Colonel Ruck, elected officials. They told us about the brave men of No. 2. They reminded us that these men, when war broke out, they decided that they wanted to serve. But when they stepped forward, they weren't rejected because they didn't have the knowledge, skills, and abilities. They weren't rejected because there were too many people that signed up to fight for king and country. Oh no. But they're rejected for one reason only: the color of their skin. They were black men, and they were told, hey, thank you for coming out, but don't forget that you're black, and it's a white man's army. If that was me, after they told me that, I'd go home and have a coffee. I would sit down with my family and relax, but not these men. They made sure that they did whatever they had to do in order to serve king and country. A number of years ago, I joined the Canadian Armed Forces. And when I joined the infantry regiment. These men weren't allowed to join the infantry. By the way, when they joined, they gave them pickaxe, shovels. But on the day when I joined, they gave me a rifle, just like every other soldier. After I joined the regiment, I was told the rich history of the regiment. I was told of the Toronto Scottish Regiment. I was told of the Royal Canadian Regiment, the Princess Patricia Canadian Light Infantry, Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, and other infantry regiments. I was told of other regiments. I was even told about the engineers. But nothing about the men that we're remembering today. I went through my career very proud of being a soldier in the Canadian Forces. I was proud of the service of Canada. I was blessed to move through the ranks and eventually appointed as a regimental sergeant major. For you that don't know who this person is, this RSM is a person who embodies the customs and the traditions of the regiment. Some are good, some are bad, some are ugly. This individual is the key advisor to the commanding officer as it relates to discipline, the career of soldiers, and any other key issues. It was while in this position that I went to an event in Ottawa and I heard about the No. 2 Construction Battalion. Nothing in my career at that point prepared me for what was to happen to me and how it changed my life. Travel with me a little bit. I was now in a position of influence, where as a black man being the RSM, I was able to influence inclusion within the regiment. I had the opportunity to go to England on duty, and I took my family with me. While we were there, you know, as a tourist, you've got to see the changing of the guards. I went with my family, and because of my position, I was able to see the changing of the guards on the palace grounds. They opened the gates so that my little family could enter, while thousands of people watched the changing of the guards from outside the gates. My daughter, 9 years old at the time, when it was all over, she came to me and said, "Daddy, we're not rich, but we have access to privilege." That statement changed my outlook. That statement changed how I did things, and it motivated me to do more. That statement allowed me to look at the No. 2 Construction Battalion through a different lens. I was appointed to the National Military Co-Chair for the Defense Visible Minority Advisory Group. Dor Gibson is here, who was my civilian counterpart. We formed a truly national group, coast to coast, that provide advice about systemic barriers to visible minorities in the Canadian Armed Forces. A member of the team was a young Captain Hards Sejan. You might have heard of that name. This team came to Nova Scotia for a strategic planning meeting, coincidentally around the time of the celebration. We met a young Russell Gross, a Henry Bishop, then the director. We participated in the ceremony, and we listened to riveting stories about No. 2. I spoke to Minister Sejan recently, and I told him that I was coming down, and he said, "Kevin, please tell them for me that the experience participating at the ceremony influenced my decision to support the national apology to descendants of No. 2. Having access to privilege, it is important for us to use that position wisely. Having access to privilege, it is imperative that we reach out to others and help them to pave the way to move to a more inclusive, supportive environment. I was ordered not to say this, but I replied that I'm no longer in uniform, so the order won't kick in until 1300 today, and I still have 15 minutes. I was invited to sit on the National Apology Advisory Council. And at my first meeting, I was proud to see everyone at the table. I saw a diverse group of civilians which represented the community. But what I also saw was a group of white men and women that represented the Canadian Armed Forces. I kept silent that night, but those of you who know me, silence is golden, but I lose the gold within a few hours. I didn't know Lieutenant Colonel Barry Pictou at the time, but I got his phone number. I said, "Sir, this is who I am. My mouth get me in trouble sometimes, and this might be one of those times." I looked at the representation at the meeting last night, but all that I saw was the number 2 again, in which we had a diverse group led by white men and women. He asked me to send him a briefing note, and he took it that day to the Army commander. By the end of the day, Colonel Pictou had authority to create a diverse group to represent the Canadian Armed Forces. I thank him for being a champion, for being an individual to say, we've got to do the right thing. And I also look at the Canadian Armed Forces at that point in time to know that the right thing had to be done. In song, we sing a song. In church, we sing a song. We've come this far by faith. Oh, some of you Christians know what I'm talking about. Leaning on the Lord. Captain George Borden advocated for an apology, but I'm sure he did not know that on July 9, 2022, the Prime Minister of Canada would stand on the hallowed grounds where the famous picture was taken of the man of number 2, where the Prime Minister said, "I apologize for the anti-black racism faced by the men of number 2 in life and in death." We speak about them, but although we commemorate them and look at what they've done for king and country, some of these men in death were buried in the colored section of the cemetery. It hasn't all been bad. Today we have black men and women in position of influence in the Canadian Armed Forces. I know of black female senior officers across the CAF. Last year, the Speaker was a flag officer in the Royal Canadian Navy, a black man. Today, I'm proud to say sitting on my right is the next Sergeant Major of the Canadian Army, a black man. We've come this far by faith. We stand on the shoulders of men who served in number 2. Earlier we sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. Faith is a substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Somebody with faith live knowing that whatever they believe is going to happen. We've had some dark days that the men of number 2 face. We had some dark days when James Fraser joined the CAF. We had some dark days when we could not see the lights at the end of the tunnel, but we kept the faith. We wrote a song that is full of hope as we saw the change in the system, full of hope that we saw that systemic barriers are being torn down. This hope, it clears a way to see the rising sun. We see that a new day has dawned. We see a coin to number 2, a stamp to number 2, a flag to number 2, a medallion for the number 2. The engineers now perpetuate the number 2. We have a song that's been written for number 2. A new day has dawned. Therefore, it is unacceptable for us to accept less than equality. It is unacceptable for the system to treat us in the way that they treated men of number 2 construction battalion. Further, it is unacceptable that when we move to a position of privilege, that we not reach out and influence the system that clearly needs to be changed. It is said that managers maintain the status quo, but leaders change the game. We must change the game. Change the game and make opportunities for men and women who are qualified but are kept in the back due to racism. We must change the system so that all black men and women, indigenous men and women, people of color are seen as able, equal, and competent. We have come this far by faith, and I believe that we will all experience victory. I served in uniform for over 3 decades. I experienced the good, the bad, and the ugly. I am the man I am today, partially because of the Canadian Armed Forces that has taught me so much. And I stand on the shoulders of men who served in the number 2 construction battalion. For those who are looking for an organization to join, let me humbly recommend to you one of the best ones that I know, the Canadian Armed Forces. Today, the path has been paved. Let us march on till victory is won. God bless you.
Church, but Kevin, you also took us to church. So if you know, you know. So thank you. Thank you for those words. Russell's name has come up a lot throughout these different remarks, and he's going to love me for doing this, but I'd just like to acknowledge properly Russell and his team and the Black Cultural Society for making sure that we can gather every single year and make sure that all of this is ready. So let's please give Russell and his team. Never going to invite me to do this again. As we come to the end of this wonderful remembrance ceremony, and I'm getting no awards for keeping us on time, but we are at the end, I would like to take a moment to reflect on the indomitable spirit and unwavering dedication of the members of the No. 2 Construction Battalion. Today we have honored the brave men who served, sacrificed, and fought against adversity and racism with resilience and strength and courage. The legacy of the No. 2 Construction Battalion serves as a beacon of inspiration for all of us. In their footsteps we find strength. In their stories, we find inspiration. They remind us that in the face of adversity, we must not falter. Let us strive to be a force for positive change, just as the members of the No. 2 Construction Battalion were. Let us build bridges where there is division, uplift others where there is despair, and foster inclusivity where there is discrimination. Together, we can create a world that truly honors the sacrifices made by those who came before us. Thank you all for joining us today and for honoring the memory of the No. 2 Construction Battalion. May their legacy continue to guide us and serve as a reminder that each one of us has the power to make a difference. Thank you very much, and we'll see you all next year.